All right, so we're going to be doing this virtual dialogue on the phases of collective impact. As I said, I'm Courtney Kohler with the National Community Action Partnership. We also have Sheri Brady, our Director for Strategic Partnerships with the Aspen Institute for Community Solutions. We work with her in a variety of ways. She's worked with our Learning Communities Resource Center before, as well as our Center of Excellence grant. So you might have seen her presenting at some of our conferences. We're excited to have her join us for this webinar today. So we're going to start out, like I said, we're going to do kind of an interview style dialogue. I'm going to ask Sheri some different questions and have her go through some different information on collective impact. And then we definitely encourage you all to engage. Just let us know what your burning questions are about collective impact. If you've had any experience with doing some of this work, we'd love to hear about it. So the first thing that we want to talk about are the phases of collective impact. And so we have this graphic here on the screen, and Sheri's going to do an overview of these phases and just let us know, what exactly do these phases mean and what do we need to know about them?
Yeah, hello, Courtney, and those of you who are joining us. Thanks for having me. So the phases of collective impact, really in our work, we sort of discovered that with the collective impact forum, so I should just say, I'm sorry, with my role with Aspen Institute for Community Solutions, I also lead our partnership with FSG and the Collective Impact Forum. So a lot of the stuff I'll be talking about is from my experience through working with the Collective Impact Forum, as well as some of our own collective impact efforts that we partner with at Aspen. So in the work and the research sort of that we've done in the collective impact forum, we've really sort of discovered that collective impact initiatives generally sort of follow 5 phases of development. And I should say that collaboration is not linear. So you see these 5 phases and all of these elements don't go, they're not phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, very linear. They can be going in a very cyclical cycle. You can be within each of these, you can be at different phases at different times. You'll sort of repeat phases in some of these ways as you're going through it, sort of like what we tend to call sort of not just a life cycle, but we're really an eco cycle, where you sort of have times of development, you'll have times of renewal and conservation, and then some creative destruction times as well, where you realize that some things aren't working well for you. So generally, sort of the phase 1 piece is sort of really figuring out your assessing readiness. Is the problem that you want to deal with actually ripe for collective impact? Is it the right time? Do you have champions? Is this a burning need in your community? Those are some of the questions that you'll ask. Initiate action, really finding time together to identify champions for the work, develop your steering committee, and then you're sort of be organizing for impact. And that's really sort of deciding what working groups you're going to have. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. In how things will be structured and what that will look like, and getting your community engagement plan ready. And then the 4th phase is really the implementation. So just kind of you'll be in clear implementation mode. How are things working well? How are you collecting data? How are you doing this work? And then sort of sustained action and impact. And that's really in later phases that you've gotten your processes and procedures down, that the work is happening, but you're always, using data to make sure that you're learning and going in the right place. You're always connecting with your stakeholders in a way that you're getting feedback and information about how things are actually working. You're disaggregating your data. You're doing this, and you're sort of carrying on the work. And again, these will come. You'll go in and out of these phases and with these different elements. You'll also see on the side things that we call success for collaborations. And these are sort of components that successful collaborations really should be continually thinking about over the cycle of their initiative, and their governance and infrastructure, which is really a focus on clarity around how your collaboratives are designed and how they are sharing responsibility and leadership within the group. And that includes things like who the backbone is, who makes up the steering committee, what your working groups are, their strategic planning. And this component is really about ensuring that your group is clear about what they are trying to accomplish together and how. What's your common agenda? What is what is everybody focused on? What are the mutually reinforcing activities that each of the organizations and stakeholders who are involved are doing to keep the work going forward? Community engagement, and that really is focused on ensuring that you're engaging different perspectives to view your issue, holistically, and really thinking both in terms of formal and informal engagement, but also how you're engaging the broader community residents, those who are most impacted by the problem that you're trying to solve, making sure that you're working toward community ownership of the initiative over time and that there's buy-in from the community, because that has to be center in order for you to really be able to get, I think, long-term sustainable change. Because if the community's not bought into it, they're really not going to be taking your solution seriously if they're not really working for all of them. So you have to be figuring out how you're constantly being able to get that information. And then the fourth is evaluation and impact. And this component is really focused on ensuring that your group is engaged in tracking progress and using the data that you're collecting and information that you're collecting to learn, that you're using it to adjust and make changes accordingly to make sure that your initiative is still meeting the needs to get to the long-term goal, making sure that the goals are the correct ones still, and that this is still what is needed and wanted in the community and the place that you're working in. And again, these are not linear. There's going to be a lot of overlap between phases on some of these things in some of the places that you're working in. And so people often are like, well, we sort of started here, we moved here, and that's going to happen because, you know, it's dynamic and this is how sort of collaboration and work flows.
All right. Thank you, Sheri.
Yeah.
So that was helpful overview. We also want to talk a little bit about the structure for collective impact. And so if you could give us just a little bit of an overview of this and talk a little bit about how these different work groups are staffed, and really, you know, how to keep people engaged throughout this process, given this structure that is suggested.
Yeah. Sure, no problem. So this graph, which is a bit of a busy one, but what we find with collective impact is that you know, usually wherever a collective impact effort is going to emerge and grow, there's already going to be an ecosystem of existing community partners, and those are sort of the little bubbles. There'll be, you know, nonprofit partners, business folks who are working together. Sometimes there'll already be collaboratives that are formed, some partnerships that are formed that are working on moving this issue or these connected issues forward. And so usually collective impact efforts will be an outgrowth of sort of these communities ecosystem of partners getting together and forming a steering group or advisory group that's really about, they realize that there's a way they need to work together to get the long-term problem solved. And so the steering committee will be made up of folks from this ecosystem, a broad range of folks across it to really get their input on how to structure the organization. And they sort of carry a lot of it. They're not doing all of the work, but they're sort of carrying that. And part of that is figuring out the backbone support, which is one of the 5 conditions of collective impact. And the backbone support is the organization that really make sure the trains are running on time, keeping an eye on shepherding things forward, has a full-time staff that's dedicated to to moving the initiative forward. And I should say that the backbone doesn't have to be one organization. It could be a couple who are doing things, but then there has to be a relationship and understanding why that is. But it can't be that there's, you know, 5 people at 5 different organizations who devote 20% of their time to the collective impact effort. That's not backbone support. It's that there's a person at these organizations who are dedicated to some element of it. And in places that we've seen the different way that backbones are doing it, for example, it could be that the backbone doesn't have the right depth of information or support or capacity to do, say, the data piece. And so that is another organization who's serving as the data backbone. And there's one person sort of dedicated to that within that organization of figuring out the processes and what the collecting the data and what the processes for collecting the data, helping to develop what the shared metrics are for the organization. And so they're sharing a backbone role focused on different elements of what a backbone does, but it's not sort of one person who's got 20% of their time doing it, if that makes sense, because sometimes people ask that. And then, you know, what will then happen is sort of the backbone is set, and the way the backbone should also be picked is the backbone is not a group who self-identifies. The backbone, there should be a process for how the backbone is chosen. There should be input from all the stakeholders who are being involved, not just the sort of 15 to 20 who might make up the steering committee, but, you know, the community members. We've seen it done in a few different ways. that there's been a series of meetings, there's a consensus on who's the best organization to do the backbone or the organizations to do elements of the backbone role. And that's chosen that we've seen a community process where the community says this is the organizations that we think, and they sort of review if there are applications, they review that process, those kinds of things. But rarely does it work if someone is anointed the backbone by even a funder, and that's happened, and that hasn't been great. Like a funder has come and said, this is the group we want to be the backbone. And while they've got some capacity, they're not really the players in the community or really have the respect of all of the folks who are part of the initiative. And we've seen that fall apart. And then you have the development of and usually this is an animated slide, so you have the development of the work groups, and the work groups are the places where who focuses on actually doing the work of moving the common agenda forward, and they can be set up different ways. They can be set up in a way that is functional, as in we have a data working group, you have a policy working group. They also usually are focused, there can be work groups who are focused on particular elements of the agenda or the continuum of activities that need to happen. For example, if you're doing youth development, there could be a working group on high school completion. There can be a working group on workforce development. So those are different elements of it. And the way that work groups are usually set up is that they're with two co-chairs, with co-chairs who are responsible for setting the meetings. They are in making sure that the work of the group is moving forward. And this is facilitating with the agenda setting for the work group, moving the working group forward, being the conduit of information back to the backbone, who are the strategic guidance and support of the work. And this is because in collective impact, leadership is shared. It's not just sort of focused it's a shared leadership model. It's not just leadership in one place that is getting everything together. And looking at the number of work groups, it'd be very difficult for the backbone to just be focused on sort of keeping the calendar of the work group and making sure that the work groups, the nitty gritty of the work groups, that would not be a good use of time or efficient for moving sort of work in a collective. And so I think that is that, and so that's the way that can happen. And those are sort of potential leadership roles for community members, other organizations with it who aren't the backbone, or who aren't necessarily on the steering committee, but have a real interest in the elements of the work, but don't necessarily want to take on sort of the strategic guidance and support, but really want to do the partner action, driven action of the work. You'll see there's a line, and we say that the steering committee and the backbones use strategic guidance and support for the collective as a whole. And the other side, the work groups and the partners are really that partner-driven action that are thinking about that. On the top, you have common agenda and shared metrics, other two elements of collective impact. And those are things that should be developed within the collaborative as a whole. So you see that it's across all the action that's happening. You should be getting input from the ecosystem of community partners, as well as the steering committee and the backbone. The steering committee is usually the body that holds it, as in, there's the process, they have it, and they're supposed to be making sure there's some strategic guidance and making sure that there's adherence to the common agenda and the shared metrics. And the arrows really are the constant communication between these groups. And there should be arrows also between the work groups, because you don't want the work groups to get siloed in this either, because it's all about them sharing information as well. That just became a really, really messy slide when you had arrows between the working groups as well. So was that helpful?
Yeah, I think so. So thank you for going over those things.
Right. And you asked a little bit about how the working group is staffed. Like I said, there's co-chairs that do that, but they should also be made up of, again, community partners, different stakeholders who work on that issue, who are interested in that. And they're usually formed by sort of where there is the momentum within the collaborative to see working movement. So there should be, again, a mix of cross-sector of actors who are part of each of the working groups.
Okay. Good, that's helpful. And can you talk also a little bit about how to kind of keep people engaged during this process? So I know a lot of times these initiatives can go on for a long time, over many years. And so keeping all of these different people, as you're working differently with many of them, keeping them engaged over time and kind of driven in the work.
Yeah, well, I will say that, people do come in and out of collective impact efforts. That's inevitable, I think, in the sense of, because as you said, it is long term. People leave their jobs, people, and new people come in. So there will be change within this. But I think ways to keep people engaged are really sort of have a plan of engagement, right? Like for sort of both thinking community level and other levels, sort of what is the level of community involvement that you want? And when I say community, I mean those with lived experience, those who are going to be most impacted by the work that's happening. Um, and for work groups, for sort of organizations that, are working on these issues, I think as long as these issues remain important to them, they're going to in some way be involved. But to keep them sort of really at the table, it's things that I think most people don't think about in the sense of like celebrating small victories and having short-term wins sort of lined up, right? Like as you think about your common agenda and the work that's going to happen, a lot of this work is long-term work, but you should have some short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals for that, and really thinking about what some of those short wins are and celebrating that, taking the time to stop, acknowledge that it's happening. Because I think also if people see sort of momentum and movement, small victories along the way, instead of waiting to celebrate or acknowledge the larger victory at the end, you keep people's like they're seeing a difference, so they're staying involved. Making sure that you share the data in constant sort of what you're learning with the data that you're collecting. It's so feedback loops and saying, so this is what we're learning, this is where we're seeing change, this is where we're not seeing change. How do we deal with that? Is important, that constant communication and feedback. Being transparent as the backbone, as a steering committee, as organizations involved, and being in building trust, right? Like explaining to people and checking in on that relationship and that trust. Building every time sort of you get together as a collaborative, I think is important because people need to feel that they're engaged. Um, in that is sort of, like I said, identifying it and sharing those quick wins, also meeting and communicating. And it's important because a lot of times you'll find people will say, oh, we want you to get your input on this, and you'll get their input, and then you go away and you never hear from them again. That pisses people off, right? Like, so I gave you my time, I thought about it, I really was engaged, and then you sort of left me in limbo. That's not a way to do it. So I think those are some ways to do it. And also just thinking about also and I think we'll get to this in another question, but thinking about there will be change because people will leave, people will come in, quit their jobs, new people will come in. When you're thinking about building, also thinking about in your effort, building sort of leadership, deep bench leadership, right? Not just focusing on people who are currently in ED positions or VP, whatever that position level is, but sort of also thinking about, especially in community, how you're developing the capacity of sort of people who are one level down, and if they're going to be the people you're going to be working with at some point, again, keeping them engaged as organizations who are involved in collective impact efforts, thinking about if your director of collective impact, some people, that's a title in some places now, leaves, like, have you thought about what your plan is for not just replacing her, but thinking about him or her, but thinking about until you can replace him or her, who are people who are engaged enough that they can step in and still be active and keep your organization active in the activities that are happening. Was that help? Was that answer what you asked?
Yes, yeah, I think so. And there's also a resource you've shared with us about
Oh yeah.
community engagement, the community engagement toolkit. So I'm going to share that in the chat for everyone to access as well.
Yeah, so the community engagement toolkit, I always use my colleague, Paul Schmitz, who is a senior advisor for the Collective Impact Forum, wrote this, and it's got sort of tools for folks to think about how they develop their community action game plan, including, asking your questions constantly. Who's at the table? Who needs to be at the table? Who are we missing? Constantly asking those questions, helping you decide sort of what's the level of engagement you want at what point, because that matters. Because it then helps you think about the activities that you do to get to that level of activity and engagement that you want with folks.
Good. Yeah, that should be helpful. Kind of related to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about building and maintaining partnerships. So, obviously as a part of this, we're looking at bringing various community partners together. So what would you say, are some of those keys to building effective partnerships and maintaining those too?
Yeah, it is. I think a big one is transparency and trust. There's a lot of intangibles in collective impact that we talk a lot about, the structure, the form, those kinds of things. but being, being transparent with it, building relationships and trust constantly, also keeping, I hate to want to add a sixth thing. I'm always like, I don't want to add to the list, but it is important too to think about always the feed and care of relationships with your partners, and what that looks like, and recognize and also having clear expectations of the partnership on both sides. So what's your process for bringing new partners on? The backbone shouldn't necessarily be deciding, by itself that they're going to bring in new partners. What's the conversation like? What's the process for doing that? Continually checking your agreements. You should be having, MOUs, memorandums of understandings between partners, and understanding sort of what people's, so that people know what their expectations are and what's expected of them when they join this collaborative, and also so they know what to expect from the backbone when they join the collaborative, and the backbone understands what is expected of them from partners. So I think that that's very important. Um, I think it's also about creating and fostering connections and relationships, not just between but amongst all of this. Like I was saying with the arrows between the work groups, making sure that the work groups are connected to each other, so that their work is happening and how their work is supporting or feeding into the work of other work groups. People want to feel that they are that what they're doing matters, right? That it matters to the collaborative, that it matters to other people in the collaboratives, that it matters to them. So I think that that is really important in the work that's happening with it. And then and also realizing that sometimes groups are going to sunset, like working groups, for example. New ones will develop as you move down the line, and people realize, oh, we should be focusing on this doesn't really work. Some will sunset because they've sort of solved not solved, but they've done what they can do for the work, and that kind of thing. And understanding that that's okay, and explain to people that doesn't necessarily mean that anything went wrong or anything was bad. It's just that this is a dynamic process. We're reacting to what the data is telling us. We're reacting to sort of what we're hearing from our partners, and this is how we're doing that work. So I think that that is important. Um, Again, sort of in going into this with an attitude of learning, that we're all sort of here to learn together, and that we're supporting each other. And I really don't rush the support building piece, right? People are like, it takes time to build trust. Yes, it does, right? If you're going to be working in a long-term exercise, it's work. It's part of the real work. And for funders, also, one of the things we try to tell them is that you should be funding that work. Like, there are elements of this that might seem soft and squishy to you, but it's core and it's central to, collaborative and creative work being done together, that there is this trust and transparency in that, and acknowledge when you make a mistake. I think we're not perfect. Things will happen. Wrong steps can be and will be made. Acknowledge that, and be ready to accept the criticism and understanding that might happen. So I think that those are some things that people should think about when they're talking about that. And we've had situations where the backbone was not the right backbone. It was, sort of, as you got into the thing a year or two in it, the backbone was no longer the right backbone, and there was a process for which people were like, we need to sunset this backbone and get a different backbone. But and it could create conflict and that kind of thing, but understanding that it's really about the work, and it's not, egos are egos, but really that it's about the work that's happening, and understanding that and being true to that, I think, are some of the things that I would say. And for me, it's sometimes it's not, rocket science. Sometimes, how do you want people to treat you? Treat people that way when you're in a partnership, right? It's sort of like the golden rule. So I think that those are some of the things I would say.
Yeah, I think that is helpful. And we did have someone ask a little, as you were talking, ask a little bit more about, how funders are usually a key partner in this work. And you touched on this and kind of those power dynamics. Do you have anything kind of additional on that about how to ensure that their role really remains equal to others in the coalition, and it doesn't, kind of create like a feeling of less than other people feeling less than the funder, since they are the one kind of supporting it, at least, as far as the resources and financial part goes.
Right, and that can get tricky because we've also had cases where the funder has been a funder has been a backbone because there wasn't another organization that was able to do it. and folks were ready to move, but they didn't think that there was another organization that was ready to be the backbone that had the capacity to do it. And that could be tricky because power dynamics are at play. And I think a big thing is that you have to acknowledge that and put that on the table, right? That we realize that we're a funder and we're at the table, but in that we, we're a champion, we're supporting it, but we're also here to get the work done. So there has to be sometimes it's a mind shift for funders and sometimes it's not, depending on the level of funder, but longer conversation, but really putting that on the table and acknowledging that there is potentially a power differential in being okay with and that's where some of the trust and relationship comes in. You have to get to the point where you're okay with calling that out or reminding the funder that that we have a memorandum of understanding where sort of we're a part of the steering committee too. You're not, you're one of the people around the table. You're not all the people around the table. It's a hard lesson and it's not an easy one to do. But if folks really want this to be true sort of collective action in that way, there has to be the acknowledgement of that and the realizing that funders are going to sometimes have to be quiet. And I think it's a matter of this constant, is the backbone. If the backbone is not the funder, like again, it can get tricky to really for the backbone to have some of those hard conversations, right? That we're grateful for the funding that you have brought to the table and for the resources that you bring to the table. We're glad that you care about this issue, but we're trying to get this is bigger than you, um, and talk about and keep the focus on the work. And understanding that sort of other folks have positional leadership within the structure that we all agreed was the best way to get this done. And sometimes I don't want to say bad guy because it's not bad guy, but it's really that sometimes the backbone has to be the group that stands up and that's part of their job, right? Thanks. But just a reminder, we're all sort of in this together. This is what we've sort of agreed to. Let's keep it moving that way. It's not easy. I can't say that it's going to be that sometimes, and some funders take it better than others. That's just an honest answer. But I think I find that especially now, as we have gotten, the first article came out about 10 years ago. And I feel that funders who are really sort of in it are getting it more. And I think philanthropy is sort of understanding their own practices. And I think part of that has been, I've seen a real shift in that as we have been grappling with sort of what's happened in the world. I guess we've all been on lockdown in some form or another, it feels like forever, but in the past year, as we've been grappling with sort of these coexisting, crises that are happening in this country right now, that has been interesting to watch and how they've had to make changes in how they do grant making to be responsive to what's happening to their grantees, right? Like we need to think about not asking for stupid reports every 2 months just because we gave them some money, but really thinking about they've got to meet a lot of needs in their community. So why don't we say that our reporting requirements we're changing our reporting requirements, so you don't have to report this much and only on that, right? That we're making our application process not quite as hard as it used to be because we need to get the money out because there's a lot of need in that's happening. So it's been interesting to sort of watch that as well.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. And we did have another question come in about.
Sorry, I can't see my screen is done doing something funny, so I can't see the chat. So please keep me aside.
Yeah, well, and some of them are coming in to me.
Okay.
So, but yeah, one of them, is asking about best practices for managing expectations. If you're looking at, something where, maybe a funder is wanting to fund something over the course of a couple of years, and we also know that community change often takes time. But some really want change to happen, much faster. And, what are those best practices for managing all of those different expectations?
Yeah, I think one of the ways, as I mentioned, sort of short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals, right? And say these are the short-term goals that are going to get us on the road to the long-term goals. And I often remind folks, especially funders that I work with, that we didn't get into these problems sort of overnight. Like even with COVID, right? Like it's highlighting things that have been in existence for years. And this is just sort of accelerated the fracture expose the fracture that's been there for a while. So I think it's also a good reminder of that sort of the reason that we chose to do a collective impact effort, is that it's a complex long-term problem where we want to see population level change. And we didn't get to this, in a 3-year grant cycle. Poverty, for example, has been the word poverty or the first poverty commission was over 50 years ago. So, and it's still not a problem that we've licked. So I think part of it is reminding folks that the long-term goal of this is a long-term problem that's deeply entrenched in a lot of places that we've been working on as a sector for years, and we haven't solved it, right? So your grant, your 5-year grant, be generous and say your 5-year grant using a collective impact model where you're asking people to think potentially in a different way of working. I will also say that I think communities have been doing sort of collective impact long before the article came out, but the article obviously gave it a framework, which is kind of a different conversation, but it gave it a framework and gave people this language to use to describe what they were doing, but that we've been working on these problems for a long time. And so I think one way of managing is saying these are, this is our plan, and we think we can get to this level of change in this, this much movement in this amount of time, this much movement in that amount of time, and this much movement in that amount of time. And being on track in that, but understanding also that one of the elements of this is sort of using the data to create this learning environment to really know what we're doing. So making sure that you've got your shared metrics and you're collecting those and you're constantly reviewing those to make sure that it's showing you an upward swing, right? Like if your theory of change, I hate to throw jargon out there, but if the work that you're doing, your theory of change is not working, your data is telling you that, then that means it's time to stop and regroup as a collective and say sort of what we thought was going to move the needle is actually not moving the needle. What are the things that we are missing? Is it environmental, as in we now have a pandemic, so obviously things are going to be moving differently? Is it that we don't have, the right people at the table? We need to bring more people to the table because this element of it we're not working on? What are those things? And that's why data is so important. And the shared metrics is not just about collecting data, but it's really about learning from the data that you've collected so that you can continue to make sure your movement is in the right place. It's also why it's important to disaggregate the data. It's not just an equity issue, but it's also making sure that you're impacting all the populations that you're working with in the same that there's upward mobility, for lack of a better term, in all of the populations that you're engaging with.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit about data just now, and so what would you say are kind of the top tips that you have on making sure that data is really guiding the effort over the course of the initiative?
Right. Again, developing those shared metrics so everyone is measuring and going for the same thing is key. Creating, like I mentioned earlier, creating a culture of learning, right? That this is not just about collecting data for data's sake. It's really about teaching us and us learning that the work we're doing is having a different. And having formal processes and time for reviewing this data and making sense of what it's telling you. Nothing is worse than sort of having, you develop strategic plans, you develop reports, you develop whatever, and it just sits on a shelf. Like, no, you need to be reviewing and understanding that. Create usable dashboards to share with your collaborative and with community members that are easy to read so people can understand the change and see what's happening. It shouldn't be a dense, thick report. It should be, infographics, here's how the needle is moving, those kinds of things, because you want it to be user friendly so people can actually understand what's happening. Again, the disaggregating of data is so key to make sure that you're seeing movement, not just in one population, but across the population, because sometimes aggregate data tells one story, but it's not the full story. And so I think that those are key things, and it's really an agreement about sort of what kind of data we need to be moving, asking, and one of, I think, is narrative change, right? Are people talking about our problem differently? Are they still saying the same thing about the problems? Is our community members telling us that they're not really seeing change in the way that we think that change was supposed to happen? That no, these problems are still existing. There hasn't been any movement at all. So I think that's a big thing for that piece of it for me. In that there needs to be agreement. It's again within the collaborative about how data is collected, when data is collected, making sure that that data is being collected in a way that is standard, or at least an agreed upon way. Those are the things I think are really helpful for getting the collaboratives to really be to make sure that they're learning from the data and that data is actually supporting and moving, is behind the work that's happening. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those things are helpful. And, one of the other things, looking at this slide where it talks about structuring for intentionality and uncertainty, we've had a lot of uncertainty this past year or so, with the pandemic and not, kind of having all those unknowns of how to manage this. What would you say about doing collective impact in times like what we're in and what we've been in for the past year, these times of drastic change and kind of uncertainty?
Yeah, I think that it's going. It's funny. I was doing a call yesterday, and a woman was like, "I just don't think that we're doing, that our collective impact efforts are on hold because we're not doing, we're not seeing the movement, we're not doing the work." And I was like, "Calm down. It's okay." Like, as one perfectionist to another, I get it, but it's okay not to be okay in the situations that we're in, right? Like, the world has shifted for so many people in so many different ways. So it really is okay not to be okay in this, and it's okay to be sort of leaning into the empathy that of the work that's sort of happening, and it's okay to stop and say to your collective and your partners and check in on them, and say, ask if they're okay, and if they're not okay, don't judge, right? Like, be understand that they're all going through things, and they might have to stop sort of looking at the long term change because there's short-term needs in their community that they have to turn an eye to. I'm on the board of a local grant making organization, and we don't usually give out direct service funds. We give out more organizing and advocacy work, and we had to do more mutual aid in COVID-19, right? We had rapid responses that were about direct services because that was what our community needed and needs in this time. And so it's okay to understand that and stop, um, to to um, to sort of see that things might not be moving ahead in the way that you want them to, and be okay with that, and sort of it's and being mindful of what your collaborative needs as a backbone organization, right? And that goes with the listening and the communicating and understanding that. I think that that is very key and important when you're dealing with sort of shaky times, or unprecedented times, I think is what we've been calling this, right? And again, it is always sort of thinking about also looking at your health. My colleague Paul wrote an article a little bit about this, and he called it sort of putting on your oxygen mask first, right? You're on a plane, if you travel with kids or someone who needs help, they say to put yours on, because if you pass out, you're not going to be of any help to anybody else, right? So I think it's the backbone. It's also doing a check-in to make sure that, you guys are, doing okay, and that you are getting your needs met as well as being, so that you can continue to be responsive to what the collaborative and collective needs at the time of what's happening. And so I think that those are some of the things that people need to think about. It's okay that you're not going to make all of your performance measurements, in this time frame. That's okay. Everything is different. Potentially a lot of funders reached out to organizations, but as the backbone who might be, dealing with funders for the collaborative as a whole, reaching out to your funders and saying, look, we need to do things a little differently now, and that has to be okay because of what we're in. I think most funders would be quite okay with that, and if they're not, that's a different conversation for that I'm working with in a different part of my work. I'm trying to get funders to deal with that. um it's also thinking about, there might be some special needs that your intended beneficiaries, those most impacted by the work, need. How do you meet that? How are you responsive to that as a collective? And that's okay if you need to be. um, and so are there ways that you can um, support them that's not about the long term necessarily, but about helping them just to survive? Because if they don't, the long term change doesn't really matter, right? Um, and so, I think it's also thinking about their contingency plans. If, I think people are changing how they're working. Obviously, most of us are virtual or working from home in a lot of places. If you're lucky enough to be able to do that, that's great. Also thinking about what your contingency plans are if someone in leadership does get sick and has to be out for a little bit with the virus, God willing that they, are out for do you have plans in place for sort of leadership in that case? Um, I think those are some of the things. I also think you probably are going to have to think about, I talked about advocating for funders, but I think you're also going to have to think about potentially, do you need to adapt your strategies and timelines as things settle? The reality of the situation is, when we get to whatever the light at the end of the tunnel might be and praying it's not a train, is that you're not going to necessarily be able to jump right into back on track, right? That's because so many things will be different. And, you might have to sort of sit down and say, your strategies need to shift as a result of what, more people are out of work, whatever it might be in our community. That's okay. Do that adjusting. You could do scenario planning. There is a tool. I can actually share that as well. I don't think I shared that with you, Courtney, but I can share that with you that we have been using in some places to think about, um, asking scenarios about what are elements of the work that can go away. If this happens, then this sort of, if we're out of work for this much longer, or out of work or out of the office, or can't be able to sort of meet in person or whatever those might be, what changes that mean for different elements of the work, those kinds of things. So think about scenario plannings in, best case, worst case, medium case scenarios. That's something that you can also do as you're doing this work, to just help you feel. Sometimes that gives people a sense of, to know that they're planning, gives them a sense of, I'm one of those people. It gives me a sense of, that it's going to be okay if I sort of have a plan. But also realize that, your plans might have to change, but again, that's okay. Thinking about the technology that you're using, how do you sort of create community using digital tools, and we've all had to learn how to create a different kind of community virtually. And this work is high touch work in a lot of cases, right? So that's something that, we've had to think about in the way that that works. And so developing those skills, how do you become sort of a better facilitator at virtual meetings? How do you keep people engaged virtually? Are there, do you have some folks in your collaborative who actually need technology and tools to be able to continue to engage in this virtual space? How do you help them? How do you support that kind of stuff? So those are some thoughts.
Yeah, and the tool that you mentioned, is that it's like a crisis triage tool, or
Yes.
community triage tool? Okay. And
Yes.
I had listened in on a webinar and thought that was great. So I actually have the link.
Okay.
Once you said that, so I'll type that um, in the chat. So
Awesome. Because I was like, I couldn't remember. I've sent you a lot of stuff, so I couldn't remember.
yes, that was a good one. So encourage everyone to check that out. And as we kind of close up, we scheduled this to be about 45 minutes to kind of give people a sense of, collective impact and kind of those burning topics, and, anything that you feel like was, didn't get to share that you want to make sure that's shared before we close.
Well, a couple of things. One, I would say there's the Collective Impact Forum. .org, which has a lot of resources. It's where you can find the toolkit, but also there's a lot of resources on our digital platform for folks who are doing this work. Also, we're having the Collective Impact Forum is having their annual action summit coming up in April. I can give the dates. I should have had those pulled up before I did it, but it is April 27th through 29th, I believe. And so it's virtual. You can find information on the Collective Impact Forum about that event. Lots of folks sharing sort of lessons learned, ways they've done the work, tools, and those kinds of things. So how-tos, case studies, all that kind of stuff.
Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. And one other thing I want to share as we close is that we do have a new e-course that we're launching along with this virtual dialogue. It's on the phases of collective impact. So Sheri has provided a lot of the content for that. And so you'll hear her voice again on the videos that we have in there. But we have launched phase 1 of this course today, and then we're going to be doing a staggering release of the remaining phases over the next several weeks. So you can access that. If you don't have a Community Action Academy account yet, it is free to create one. So I'll go ahead and enter this link in the chat here to get to the course. If you already have a course, if you already have an account on Community Action Academy, you simply need to log in. Once you get to this, there we go, make sure I have the right link. Once you get to this link, you simply have to log in. If you don't already have an account, it should prompt you at the main login page, and then you'll just have to scroll down where it says, is this your first time here? And it's a very simple form to fill out. And then you just simply have to do an email confirmation after you fill in your information. And then you can get in and go to this link and access the course. So it should allow for self-enrollment. You'll just have to click a button to enroll yourself. So we'll be releasing that, and we'll make sure that the people on this webinar today get the information about the release of the additional phases. And then, of course, this is the home link for Community Action Academy. You can see some of these course categories over at the side of some of the different topics that we do have available in addition to this Phases of Collective Impact course. And with that, I think the last thing I'll share is an evaluation link. So if you would go and it's not working out. So we do have an evaluation link, and for some reason it's not copying anymore. Let me see if I can just type it in manually. All right, so that should work for folks to give us some feedback on today's webinar. And again, we thank you all for joining us. And Sheri just put her information in the chat as contact information, so feel free to reach out to her. And then on the National Community Action Partnership team, always feel free to reach out to myself or Erin Wicks on the organizational capacity building team. So thank you all, and thank you, Sheri, for joining us today.
Thank you. Take care.